Hi everyone, this is Professor Hall, and last time we talked about adding evidence to your paragraph using quotation or using summaries and paraphrases. Today we're going to talk about adding evidence to your paragraph with quotes. So the evidence sandwich that we discussed last time, we introduce our evidence, we give our evidence, and we cite our evidence, and then we explain it. And again, we're going to focus on giving the evidence today, but you really want to, as I said last time, and just in case you're watching this one first, you want to have a balance. You want to have a balance here between your evidence and your analysis or your explanation of that evidence. You have to have both. You can't just go in and eat a sandwich that's just bread, although people around here sometimes eat hard rolls for breakfast, which I find interesting. And similarly, I don't want to go and just get a stack of 10 beef patties with no bread to hold them together. So the same thing goes for your essays. And I want to stress this because over and over and over, I find that people do one of two things. They either give way too much evidence and they don't explain it, or they have a lot of vague explanations and kind of vague statements, but they don't have any evidence to back them up. It's an easy way to have your paper go from A to a B or a B to a C or a C to a D. So make sure that you have a good balance. It's the number one thing you can do. Evidence from your sources. Again, as I said before, you're taking all of this stuff from your sources. Examples, facts, statistics, details, description, narration. Sometimes you're going to boil it all down into a full summary. Sometimes you're going to take one of those things, like a main idea, and you're going to paraphrase it. So if it's in a sentence, you'll take that sentence and you'll rewrite it in your own words. Other times, you'll find something that you want to quote. Now, we call it a direct quotation because you are quoting something the author has to say. I stress this because sometimes I have people who I tell them they have to have a quote, and they look for things in the text that already have quotation marks around them. That's the author quoting other people. And you could use one of those things in your article, in your essay, but really you're quoting the author. So you're taking something that is in an article that you're reading and you're attributing it to them. You're putting quotation marks around it to quote them. So how do we have an indirect quotation is another word for paraphrase. It means you're not saying their words exactly. So here we're going to just talk about direct quotations. I will not use unnecessary quotation marks. We want to use a quotation when the author's language is memorable, when the author's words are very clear and concise, and rewording it would be pointless. And sometimes we want to have a quotation where there is a main idea, an important fact or statistic, or an interesting supporting detail. If this is not the case, then you need to rethink whether you want to quote an author. And really, in an essay that is 3 or 4 or 5 pages, which is about the length for a lot of the things you're doing in my class this semester, we're focusing on quality instead of length. But for that, you should not have quotations that are overly long. You really should have quotations that are 1 to 2 lines. We'll talk about this more later. And you really don't want more than 1 or 2 a page. So think about that. 1 to 2 lines long, 1 to 2 per page. Tips for finding a direct quotation. Your instructors, including myself, but this class really, college composition, is helping you succeed in your other classes. So your professors want to make sure that you understand the readings. So can you reword them? Can you interpret them? And can you explain them? That's really what they're looking for. They don't want you to just parrot it back and quote, 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 quote from one of your sources. They want you to explain and analyze your sources. So don't have just quotes strung together. Instead, you want to quote a small amount of writing when you're adding a quotation. This can be a few words or an entire sentence, but again, it should really not be longer than 1 to 2 lines on your paper. Not 1 to 2 sentences, because a lot of the things you're quoting will have quite long sentences. So if you have more than 2 or 3 lines, you really should be doing a summary or a paraphrase instead. I do not want you for my class to have a block quote. A block quotation means that you have a very long piece of text, usually 60 words or longer, and you indent it in a weird way and you make it look like a block because it's so long. For the length of papers, I don't want you having block quotes. Block quotes are really used for when you have papers that are like 15, 20, 25 pages long, because then you can have a longer quote because you have more room to explain it as well. If you have a 1 to 3 ratio, you can have a block quote that's 6 lines long and then explain it for 18 lines, right? But in a shorter paper, you really don't need that. So also when you're quoting, use the exact words the author uses. The exact words. Why? Because if you don't use the exact words and you have quotation marks around it, then you are plagiarizing. It's part of fabrication. And as I mentioned when I gave you guys the plagiarism video, I actually know people who have almost lost their jobs because of not quoting things the right way. And obviously, that's because they're college professors, but I don't want you guys to lose points on a paper in my class or anybody else's. So I really want you to learn how to do things correctly. So here is our first. So this is a longer portion of text from Ron Rosenbaum's Let Them Eat, the same article that we looked at actually in the video about paraphrasing and summarizing. So I'm choosing my quotation. Just for time purposes, I don't need to read you the whole text, but basically he says, the science on the matter is changing as well. We are discovering that fatty delights can actually be good for you. I think that's kind of interesting, and it goes against some of the science that people might know about, so I want to quote it. So I highlighted what I want to quote, and then I'm going to write my quotation. The article claims that recently scientists have been, quote, discovering that fatty delights can actually be good for you. Now you notice I rewrote some of it, and then when I start using his actual words, I have a comma, then I have the quotation mark, I finish the quotation mark, and then I have my citation. Since I have the article and I didn't use the author's name, I have the author's last name here, and then I have my page number. Also, you notice that the period comes after the citation, which comes after the quotation marks. So you don't want to put a period after you want it after the citation. Here's another example. This time we have something from the other article we looked at by Gina Belafonte. So she says, it's hard not to wonder whether Mr. Bloomberg's soda initiative might have garnered more enthusiasm, though obviously not from the soft drink industry, whose ad campaigns against it imagine democracy imperiled at the threat of less Pepsi, if it had been delivered within the context of a more consistent and compassionate message. Now, what's interesting about this quote is that I don't really care about this whole thing right here. Because if I take that out, which I'm kind of going to cross out for you guys right here. Sorry, I'm using a mouse, so this can be a little difficult. There we go. If I take that out, she says, it's hard not to wonder whether Mr. Bloomberg's soda initiative might have garnered more enthusiasm if it had been delivered within the context of a more consistent, compassionate message. That part to me is interesting, and I want to quote it. So what I do is I cut some of it out, and I have a little bit of a paraphrase. Belafonte, there's the author's last name. So my introduction claims that Bloomberg's political agenda to end obesity would have been accepted if, quote, it had been delivered within the context of a more consistent, compassionate message to the city's underserved. So here I paraphrase a little bit. And then when I use her direct words, I put it in quotation marks because I have her last name here. Here in my citation, I just have the page number. And then I would have an explanation for the quote. So here is the explanation. In other words, if Bloomberg had been kinder to people in poverty and had focused more on making the impoverished people of New York healthier instead of merely trying to force them to be thinner, he might have gotten more political support from both Democrats and Republicans. That's it. That's a good explanation. And now I have a balance between the quotation, which is 3 lines, and my explanation, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I have a 1-to-2 ratio here, but I might have had some in the beginning of the paragraph, and maybe I'd have a little bit more explanation after if this was a real essay. Choosing the quotation. Something should add meaning to your argument. It should have a main point in the article that could not be said any other way. It should be interesting. It should support your thesis and the main idea of your paragraph. If it does not fit with the main idea of your paragraph, pick a different quote. I think this is the thing a lot of times that happens. People see something that's worded kind of neat and they want to use it, but it doesn't really fit in with their argument. So make sure that it does. It should be punchy, direct, or even dramatic, so it's kind of worded in an interesting way. And it comes from a source you trust, which we'll talk later on about how to pick sources that are reliable. It should also be relatively short and to the point. If it's not, then you should take out some of the quotation. So one of the things that I want to say, I didn't include this, so I'm just going to write it here because I realize now that I forgot, is that you have to introduce your quote, as I said before, but I didn't, and I don't know if I deleted a slide or whatever. Introduce your quote. You have to introduce your quote in a couple of ways. You need to either have, something like the author says, and then a comma, and then whatever the quotation is. You could have the author writes, and then your thing. Sorry, again, I'm using a mouse here. So, research shows a study suggests. But you need some kind of noun there, like the author's. Let's say the author's last name is Smith. So you could have Smith explains, states, says, writes, whatever you want to have. But you have to have that. You can kind of think of it like when you're reading if you're reading a novel, if you have two characters talking back and forth and there's no indication of who is saying what that is called is a dropped quotation. And I will mark you off points for having a dropped quotation because they're very confusing. Who said it? Why did they say it? Why is it important? You cannot have a dropped quotation. Don't have that. Make sure that you actually introduce your quote. Now, other points about choosing quotations. I apologize for not including that before. But other tips for choosing your quotations. You can have quotes that you don't necessarily agree with but are still important. That's useful if you want to argue against another side's point. So we'll talk more about counter argument when we get into the art of arguing, which is going to come in a couple units. Make sure that you demonstrate why you don't agree with the quote. Or make sure you demonstrate why you do agree with the quote. Either way, you need to have really clear explanation. Adding your voice. Follow each quote with the explanation, as I just said. So this can be a short description of what it means if you actually explain it, or how it relates to your topic. You can also analyze it, show an author's strengths, show why they are correct, show why they're incorrect if you're arguing against them. Don't use quotes instead of your own words. Quotes are meant to add weight to your argument, not to replace it. Your paper should be balanced. Again, I've said that 3 times already. So, a quote within a quote. I had somebody ask me about this in my other class, so I just wanted to include this here. Just to talk about the actual physical mechanics. This is an apostrophe. We use it for contractions like can't, cannot. When we're taking out words, becomes can't. Here we have I am becomes I'm. We also use it for possession. So Megan's book. The book belonging to Megan, right? Single quotes look just like apostrophes, but when you put them by words, they kind of curve in a little bit. Double quotes is really what you're probably used to seeing right there, where there's 2 instead of just 1. So here, Jones made an error when he reported, quote, now this is from Jones. In the past year, President Obama has called for this part. He is quoting President Obama, former President Obama. Single quotation marks, at least 8 times. So I have a quotation from Jones and a quote within his quote. So because there's a quote within a quote, you're using single quotation marks to set that off. And end to gun control is what he's saying President Obama said, right? That's how you do a quote within a quote. You probably won't use it ever, but somebody asked me about it, so I thought I'd include it here. So, shortening quotes. Sometimes you have something that is too long. So here is a piece of text about pain relief at the dentist. I think it's way too long to quote, right? So what I'm going to do for my essay is I'm going to use a combination of summarizing it and quoting it. There have been a lot of advances in pain management at the dentist. You can use sedatives or local anesthesia. However, a new report suggests that some dentists use, and now here is where I have my quote, technology like water lace, a laser energy, and water spray process. Why do I have that quoted? Because I can't really say the words water lace, which is like the brand name. I can't say laser energy really any other way, and water spray process. It's pretty specific, right? So I've taken this part about pain relief. There's a paraphrase here for pain management. Sedatives, local anesthesia. Here they have pharmaceutical options. So I've paraphrased that as well. Kind of summarized his point and then had the quotation. Another way to do this is I'm going to show you the same quotation done a different way. Here I have, I want to take maybe the whole quote, but I can't quote everything. So I take out 2 sets of words. You can now choose among pharmaceutical options such as nitrous oxide. I deleted this part that's in parentheses, and I deleted this part that's in parentheses. Not just because they're in parentheses. You can really delete any words and just take them out. So I've taken those out, quoted the author directly, and I have direct quotes, and I use a square bracket with a ... That's called an ellipsis. Elliptical means round, right? When you ride the elliptical. Ellipsis means ... You're taking out words. So one of the only things you have to be careful of when you're shortening quotes is that you don't change the author's original intention. Here, I'm just taking out some stuff that he had in parentheses. It wasn't really essential, important information. Other times, I don't want people to take out words to create a bias to prove their point. So somebody might have, like on a movie poster, maybe a critic said, "This movie was so horrible it made me laugh." and they'll cut out the first part and they'll put that ellipsis, ... and they'll just have, "It made me laugh." That's really misleading, right? So you can't do that to mislead people, but you can do it to shorten up quotes, especially if a quote is too long and you don't want as much in your paper. So that is it for this segment, and I look forward to reading your papers. Have a great day.